Tonight we're starting with something a little different. There is a room, climate-controlled, dimly lit, smelling faintly of mineral dust and circulated air, where a piece of baked clay sits under a low examination lamp. The clay is about the size of a thick paperback. Its edges are broken. Some of it is gone, lost somewhere in the soil of southern Iraq, and it has been that way for a very long time. The object is roughly 4,000 years old. It should have crumbled. It should have dissolved back into the ground it came from. But it didn't. Before we go any further, if this kind of quiet, slow history is something you return to at night, a like on this video helps more than you'd think. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do that. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, whether it's a bedroom in Texas, a flat in London, or somewhere it's just gone dark outside. Drop it in the comments when you wake up. For now, your only job is to rest. The day is already behind you. You don't need to hold on to anything. Now, let's begin. The room you're imagining, it isn't far from the truth. The Penn Museum in Philadelphia holds tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets in its collection. Most of them excavated from a site in central Iraq called Nippur, beginning in the 1880s. They are stored carefully, catalogued, photographed. Many of them have been digitised and made available through a project at Oxford called the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature. Scholars refer to it simply as the ETCSL. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad holds thousands more. Between these institutions and a handful of others, the written remains of a civilization that ended before Rome existed have been slowly, quietly reassembled over the last 150 years. The tablet under the lamp tonight is one small piece of that. You are close to it now. The examination lamp angles across its surface at a low rake, so the shadows fall into the grooves and the wedge-shaped marks become legible, or nearly legible. These marks are cuneiform. The word comes from the Latin for wedge-shaped, cunus, and the name describes the tool as much as the result. A cut reed pressed into soft clay at a slight angle, lifted, pressed again, each impression leaving a small triangular head with a trailing stroke behind it. Thousands of these marks, arranged in columns, in lines, in careful rows, cover the surface of the tablet. Some of the signs are clear, some are worn, and on the right edge, where the clay broke away at some point, in antiquity possibly, or during excavation, possibly, no one knows exactly, the text simply stops. Signs trail into absence. What remains is a list. And somewhere near the top of that list, partly intact, is a Sumerian word, me. It is one of the smallest words in the language. One syllable. 2 letters in transliteration. And it names something that the ancient Sumerians considered fundamental to the world. Not in a casual way, not as a figure of speech, but in a way that suggests they believed these things held civilization together. The me appear in hymns, in myths, in administrative records. They appear in a text composed around 4,000 years ago by a woman named Enheduanna, who was a high priestess in the city of Ur, and is now regarded as one of the earliest named authors in recorded history. In that text, known today as the Exaltation of Inanna, or by its Sumerian opening words, Nin-me-shara, Enheduanna addressed the goddess Inanna in a long formal literary hymn. She listed Inanna's attributes. She described Inanna's power over the me, and that phrase, Nin-me-shara, carries within it this word that keeps appearing in the oldest written records we have. The Sumerians believed Inanna was the goddess of love, of war, and of sovereignty, a figure of enormous range and contradiction in their religious tradition. Ancient texts describe her as holding dominion over the me, receiving them, carrying them, distributing them to the cities of the world. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water in Sumerian tradition, is described in other texts as the one who kept the me in his underwater dwelling, the Abzu, until Inanna came to claim them. What exactly they were, that is a harder question. The scholars who have spent careers on this word tend to agree on the broad outline. The me were something like divine decrees or cosmic powers, or foundational principles. The underlying conditions that made civilization possible. Not laws exactly, not commandments. Something older than that and harder to name. The ancient lists of me that have survived include things like kingship, priesthood, descent into the underworld, the scribal arts, music, the craft of the blacksmith, truth, falsehood, grief. rejoicing. They include concepts and practices side by side with no apparent hierarchy between them. All of it bundled into a word that, in Sumerian, seems to carry something between a noun and a verb. A thing that also does, a principle that also acts. Scholars still argue about it. They probably always will. For a while, this tablet on the table was just one of many. When the Penn expeditions brought crates of clay back from Nippur in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, no one had the tools yet to fully understand what they were looking at. The language itself had to be decoded first, the grammar reconstructed from scratch, the vocabulary assembled sign by sign, tablet by tablet, by people who had no living informants, no Sumerian-speaking population to consult. Everything came from the clay. It took generations of work, and by the time the language was well enough understood to read texts like this list with some confidence, the 20th century was nearly over. That is not an unusual story in this field. It is more or less the normal one. The alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia. The flat, fertile land between the lower reaches of the Tigris and the Euphrates is where the oldest of these records come from. Cities like Nippur, Eridu, and Uruk were already ancient when the tablets were being written. Nippur in particular functioned as a religious and scribal centre for centuries. Texts were copied there, stored there, studied there. The tablet under the lamp almost certainly passed through the hands of a scribal student at some point. Someone learning the signs by copying older texts. The way students copy sentences by hand even now. What the student made of the word me, whether it carried weight for them the way a technical term carries weight, or whether it was simply something to memorise, we have no way of knowing. What people rarely noticed, early in the scholarship, was how consistently the me appeared across different kinds of texts. They show up in myths, they show up in administrative documents, they show up in lament poetry. That spread across genres suggested the word was doing real conceptual work, that it wasn't just a religious term borrowed into other contexts, but something closer to a foundational category, something the Sumerians reached for when they needed to name what kept things in their proper order. The lamp hums very quietly. The air in the room is slightly cool. The tablet sits exactly as it was placed, under the light. Not quite whole, its broken edge facing you. There is something about the texture of it, the actual clay surface, the slight irregularity of each wedge impression, the places where a scribal hand pressed harder or lighter, that makes the distance feel shorter than it should. 4,000 years is a number that means almost nothing to a human body. But a handprint in clay, even an impression left by a reed, carries a different kind of weight. Someone sat with this. Someone made each of these marks deliberately. And what they were trying to name, whatever the me were in their fullness, is still only partly understood. The list on this tablet trails into its broken edge, and the missing signs have not been found. Somewhere beyond these walls, beyond the museum corridors, and the catalogued crates and the quiet hum of preservation systems. The land those tablets came from is still there, the plain between the rivers, the dry summer heat, the place where, 4,000 years ago, and further back still, people were already trying to name the things that held the world together, writing them down in lists, in hymns, in careful columns of pressed clay, as if putting the name to something was the first step toward keeping it. The tablet doesn't move, the lamp holds its angle, and the word at the top of the list waits, the way old things wait, without urgency, without need, simply present. The word is still there on the tablet, under the lamp. But the world it came from is something else entirely, wider, warmer, older than the archive that holds it now. The southern Mesopotamian plain in the late afternoon looks from any kind of height like a very flat painting. The land is almost completely level. The rivers move through it slowly, spreading into marshes at their edges, feeding irrigation channels that branch away from the main current, like the veins on the back of a hand. Date palms line the banks in long, irregular rows. The water in the channels is brown and slow. The air close to the ground smells of mud and cut grass and, in certain seasons, the particular sweetness of date blossoms. Further from the river, the soil dries and cracks, but near the water the ground is always slightly damp, and the evenings carry a coolness that comes up from the surface as the heat of the day releases. This is where it started. Not in one moment, not because of one decision, but gradually. Over centuries that moved so slowly, they barely felt like change to the people living through them. You can still feel, at the edge of that plain, what it might have meant to build there. The land offers almost nothing in the way of stone or timber. What it offers instead is soil that, when mixed with water and straw and left in the sun, becomes something you can stack. Mud brick. The walls of Sumerian cities were built from it, repaired with it, dissolved back into it when they were abandoned. Entire cities rose and fell on these plains, without leaving the kind of hard, permanent mark that stone does. What they left instead was layer upon layer of compressed mud. Tells, archaeologists call them, mounds that rise slightly above the surrounding plain because millennia of human habitation have piled up inside them. The city, when it was alive, was a layered place. At the top of the physical hierarchy stood the ziggurat, the stepped temple platform that rose above the flat rooflines of the residential quarters and the market streets below. It wasn't a building exactly, it was a mountain, built by people who lived in a land with no mountains. The Sumerians placed their temples on platforms that raised them above the floodline, above the mud, towards something higher. Each city had its own patron deity in Sumerian belief, the divine presence that was understood to inhabit that place, to watch over it, to require its temples, and its offerings, and its songs. Around the ziggurat spread the city proper, the temple precinct with its storehouses and administrative offices, the neighbourhoods of craftsmen and merchants, the grain distribution centres, the docks where boats came in from the river with fish and reeds and bitumen. The Sumerian economy ran on grain, fish, wool, and the labour of ordinary people, who rarely appear in the written record except as names on ration lists. They ate bread made from barley, they worked in the fields and the workshops, they lived in mud brick houses with small interior courtyards that blocked the midday heat and let the cooler air settle in the evenings. Over time, this kind of life generated paperwork. Not paperwork in the sense of forms and bureaucracy, though that came too. What writing began as, in the very earliest phase, was accounting. Tokens of clay shaped into spheres and cones and discs used to represent quantities of goods. A certain number of jars of oil, a certain weight of grain. Before signs on tablets, before cuneiform, before literature, there were clay tokens in sealed clay envelopes. The envelope was broken to read its contents. The tokens inside were the message. And at some point someone realised it was more efficient to press the shape of the token into the outside of the envelope rather than seal it inside. And in doing that, almost by accident, invented the principle of writing. That is the stripped-down version of a long, complicated story. The truth is the transition was slower and messier than that, and the scholars who study it still disagree on certain points. But the direction is clear, from accounting to representation, from tokens to signs, from administrative records to something that could carry language. By the late 4th millennium, BCE, somewhere around 3200 to 3000 BCE, the city of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia was producing tablets with pictographic signs that were on their way to becoming what we now call cuneiform, Uruk. The Sumerians called it Unug. Its ruins lie near the modern Iraqi town of Waqqa, in the south of the country. In its time, Uruk was one of the largest cities in the world, possibly the largest for a period during the late 4th millennium. The Sumerians believed it was Inanna's city, the place she presided over and protected. Ancient texts describe her as deeply tied to Uruk, its temples and its people. The monumental buildings that archaeologists have uncovered there, the great temple complex known as the Iana, or House of Heaven, speak to a city that understood itself as doing something important in the world. And it was. Writing came out of Uruk. The earliest tablets with signs that would become cuneiform were found there. The administrative apparatus that would shape Sumerian civilization for the next 2,000 years grew out of that same complex. Whatever else Uruk was, it was the place where the habit of recording became systematic, where writing moved from a tool for counting jars to a medium for something else entirely. Meanwhile, further south, near the place where the rivers once reached the head of the Persian Gulf, before centuries of silt pushed the shoreline further away, lay a city the Sumerians considered the oldest of all, Eridu, modern Tel Abu Shahrain. Archaeologists excavating there in the 20th century found evidence of continuous occupation going back to the Ubaid period, somewhere around 5,500 BCE, possibly earlier. Layer beneath layer beneath layer, the remains of temples built, dismantled, and rebuilt on the same sacred footprint for thousands of years. The Sumerians believed Eridu was the first city. In their tradition, it was the seat of Enki, the god of wisdom and freshwater, whose underground dwelling, the Abzu, lay beneath the city and beneath the waters of the world. The connection to freshwater was not metaphorical. The land around Eridu in ancient times was closer to the marsh edge than it is now, and the presence of groundwater that was sweeter than the surrounding channels would have felt to people who knew how rarely that happened in that landscape, like something given rather than found. The scribal tradition that eventually produced the texts about the Emi grew up in cities like these, and was concentrated most visibly at Nippur, which functioned as a kind of neutral sacred ground, a city no one dynasty fully controlled, and that every dynasty therefore treated with particular care. The temples at Nippur were maintained by rulers from Ur, from Akkad, from Babylon. The scribal schools there, the Aduba, which translates roughly as tablet house, trained generations of scribes in the art of writing. Students copied out texts by hand, again and again until the signs were automatic. They copied lexical lists, long inventories of words organised by category. They copied hymns and proverbs and mythological narratives. They copied texts about the me.
The physical conditions of that work were specific. A student at the Aduba sat with a lump of clay, worked it into a flat tablet with their hands, and pressed signs into the surface with a cut reed stylus. The clay had to be the right consistency, wet enough to hold an impression cleanly, firm enough not to smear. The reed was trimmed to a particular shape. The technique took time to learn. The clay dried relatively quickly, which meant the scribe worked efficiently or started over. Finished tablets were sometimes fired in a kiln, sometimes simply dried in the sun, sometimes stacked in archives on reed shelving and left. When institutions were abandoned, the tablets were often buried in the rubble, and in burial they were preserved. That is the basic paradox of the archive. Destruction saved it. The fire that burned a building baked the tablets inside it harder. The collapse that buried a room sealed its contents against the centuries. The tablets that survived were often the ones that no one had planned to keep. The scribes who worked at Nippur in the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, were already copying texts that were centuries older than they were. They were transmitting a tradition they had received rather than invented, working in a language, Sumerian, that was by their time no longer spoken as a mother tongue in most of Mesopotamia. Sumerian had been largely replaced in daily speech by Akkadian, but in the schools it was studied, copied, preserved, the way Latin was studied in medieval Europe long after it had ceased to be anyone's first language. A prestige language, a sacred language, a language in which the old things had been said, and in which they continued to be said, because that was how they had always been said. And in that language, in those schools, in those tablets, the word me continued to appear. In lists that tried to inventory the foundations of civilization. In hymns addressed to divine figures who, the Sumerians believed, carried those foundations with them. In texts that tried to say, in the plainest possible way, here are the things that make the world the world. There is something in that habit of mind, the impulse to inventory, to name, to list the invisible structures that hold a civilization upright, that feels less foreign the longer you sit with it. Every complex society has some version of it. The categories shift, the names change, but the underlying instinct, the sense that if you can name a thing, you have a better chance of keeping it, that is older than Sumer, and it hasn't disappeared. The plain stretches out into the dark now. The canals carry moonlight. The mud brick walls hold the last warmth of the sun in their surfaces, releasing it slowly into the cooler air. Somewhere at the edge of the southern marsh, at the place the old texts always come back to, the ground is slightly damp and the water table is close to the surface. The city that stood there believed that everything of value, every law, every craft, every form of knowledge, was kept somewhere beneath those waters, in a place that had a name. And the name of the keeper was Enki. The name carries a particular kind of weight in the old texts. Not a dramatic weight, not the weight of a ruler or a conqueror, something quieter than that. Enki, in Sumerian tradition, was the figure associated with wisdom, with fresh water, with the organising principles of craft and knowledge and cultural life. Not the god of war, not the god of storms, the god, the texts suggest, who understood how things worked, and who kept that understanding somewhere specific. The place was Eridu. The shrine at Eridu, as the old literary texts describe it, centred on a pool of still fresh water, the Abzu. In Sumerian understanding, this was not simply a well or a cistern. The Abzu was the freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the surface of the earth, the source from which rivers and springs and groundwater all originated, rising through the ground as if pressed upward from below. Enki's dwelling sat at the point where that deep water met the world above it. The texts describe his temple as built over the water itself. The mud brick walls around it, the surface of the pool reflecting the light from small oil lamps, the smell of reeds and damp clay constant in the air. In that setting, the me were said to reside. The Sumerian texts don't describe them as physical objects sitting on a shelf, though they are sometimes spoken of as if they could be held, carried, handed over. They are also spoken of as abstract, as divine laws, as cosmic offices, as the preconditions for civilized life. The surviving compositions hold both of these framings at once, without resolving the contradiction, and the scholars who study them have largely concluded that the Sumerians were not confused about this. They simply had a different relationship to the distinction between concrete and abstract. A thing could be a principle and a portable object at the same time. The me were whatever kept each element of civilized life operating correctly, and that, in their understanding, was something Enki held. The text that brings this into the clearest focus is the composition scholars now call Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization from Eridu to Erech. Erech is the biblical name for Uruk. The title is a modern scholarly designation, not a Sumerian one. The Sumerians identified compositions by their opening lines rather than a title. But the subject is precisely what the name suggests. And what we have of it comes primarily from old Babylonian copies excavated at Nippur, pieced together from multiple fragmentary tablets, collated and reconstructed by scholars working across more than a century. The text is not complete. Large sections are damaged or missing entirely, or survive only in single copies where the cuneiform signs are too worn or broken to read with confidence. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford marks these gaps carefully in its translations. And the scholars who have worked on the composition, Samuel Noah Kramer was among the first to study it extensively in the mid-20th century, and later scholars have refined and corrected his readings considerably, are careful about what they claim the text says, versus what it appears to say in damaged passages. What survives is enough to follow the shape of the story. The composition begins, in the lines that are legible, with Inanna in Uruk. The tablets describe her looking toward Eridu. The precise framing of her initial intention, what she plans, what she wants, how she frames her journey to herself, is one of the areas where the surviving text is partially broken. What is clear from the subsequent lines is that she undertakes the journey, She travels to Eridu by water, by way of the canals that connected the cities of southern Mesopotamia. The vessel the texts associate with her journey is called the Boat of Heaven, a term that appears elsewhere in Sumerian literature as well, and that suggests something more than an ordinary reed boat. Though what exactly the phrase meant in its original cultic context remains an open question. The journey across the canals would have been, in practical terms, a slow one. The distance between Uruk and Eridu is not extreme, but travel by water in the flat southern marshlands depended on current, wind, and the depth of the channels, which varied by season. The picture that comes through the surviving lines, even through the gaps, is of an arrival rather than a rush. Inanna comes to Eridu, and Enki receives her. The hospitality scene that follows is one of the portions of the text that scholars have been able to piece together with some confidence across multiple tablet fragments, though individual lines remain uncertain. The tablets describe Enki and Inanna at a meal together. Food, drink, a shared table. The composition uses this setting as the context for a long exchange, though the precise content of the conversation is not fully recoverable. What becomes clear in the lines that follow is that the me begin to pass. Enki, the texts say, offers them to Inanna, one by one as the exchange unfolds. The surviving lines of the transfer read like a slow inventory. Kingship, the office of the En, the high priestly role. Godship, the descent to the underworld and the ascent from it. The scribal arts. Music, the craft of the smith. Leatherwork, woodwork. Truth, the descent into the land of no return. The ascent from the land of no return. Fire, the craft of the weaver. Lines of the composition that are preserved list these things calmly, in sequence, without dramatic commentary. Each me is named, each passes. The repetition in the surviving text has a quality that scholars have compared to liturgical enumeration, the kind of list whose power comes not from any single item, but from the accumulation of all of them together. What people rarely noticed, reading these translations for the first time, is how many of the me are not achievements, but conditions. Descent into the underworld. Falsehood alongside truth. Grief placed on the same list as rejoicing. The Sumerians were not listing only the things that a civilization hoped to have. They were listing everything a civilization actually was, including the difficult parts, the underside, the necessary shadows. The me as a concept seems to encompass not just what civilization aspired to, but what it consisted of, in full. Over time, scholarly interpretation of the text has moved in several directions. One reading treats the story as a reflection of an actual historical process, the rise of Uruk and its absorption of religious authority that had once been centered further south at Eridu. Uruk's dominance in the late 4th millennium is archaeologically attested. The story of Inanna carrying the me from Enki's city to her own could, on this reading, be the mythological expression of a real transfer of cultural and institutional prestige. Another reading treats the text as purely theological, a literary meditation on the nature of divine authority and the role of Inanna as the figure who gathers and holds the powers of civilization. The tablets don't settle this. They were not written to settle it. They were written to transmit something, and what exactly they were transmitting, institutional history, theological statement, scribal curriculum, ritual accompaniment, is not specified within the text itself. The composition simply begins, unfolds, and records. Isimud appears in the text as well. Enki's minister, described in Sumerian tradition as a two-faced figure. Not in a moral sense, but literally. Ancient texts and some surviving imagery associate Isimud with a doubled face, able to look in two directions at once. The minister serves as Enki's messenger, and later, when the story develops in the direction it develops, as the figure Enki sends in pursuit of Inanna and the boat. That part of the narrative comes later in the composition. In this first movement, Isimud is present mainly as a function of the scene, an intermediary, a witness, a presence within the hospitality the tablets describe. The me continue to pass. The lines continue. And at some point in the composition, preserved more fully in some tablet fragments than in others, the list that has been accumulating is loaded onto the boat of heaven. Inanna, the texts say, takes what she has received and prepares to return to Uruk. The boat is described as sitting low in the canal, weighted with what it carries. The exact nature of that weight, what the me would have looked like physically if they were objects, or whether the image is entirely figurative, is not something the text resolves. The boat carries them. That is what the tablets say. And the boat begins, in the remaining lines of this section of the composition, its slow journey back across the water. The canal in the late afternoon is very still. The palm fronds at the edge of the bank barely move. The surface of the water reflects the colour of the sky with no distortion. And the boat, carrying what it carries, moves gradually away from Eridu, away from the pool in the mud-brick shrine, away from the underground water beneath it, away from the figure the Sumerians believed had held all of this in place since before anyone could remember. The inventory that went onto that boat, the names, the offices, the arts, the conditions of civilized life, was not fully settled. Not in the text, not in the scholarship. The surviving lines record what they record, and where they break off, the reconstruction becomes careful and provisional. There are me in the list whose meaning is clear. There are me whose Sumerian term survives, but whose exact significance is debated. And there are places in the composition where the clay is simply gone, the signs unreadable, the transfer incomplete. The boat moves on regardless. Whatever it carries, and the canal stretches ahead, long and quiet and brown in the fading light, in the direction of Uruk.
The canal at night moves differently than it does in daylight. The sound changes. The water against the hull of a reed boat is softer after dark, more even, less broken by wind. The surface reflects whatever is above it without distortion. Stars, the edge of the moon, the dark line of palm fronds along the bank. The smell off the water in the cool hours is clean and slightly mineral, the way water smells when it comes from deep underground rather than from rain. The boat of heaven, as the tablets describe it, is somewhere on that water, between Eridu and Uruk, moving slowly, as things move on flat southern canals, at the pace of a current that has no urgency and no memory of where it started. And what it carries is still being named. The surviving list of me runs, in the portions scholars have been able to reconstruct with confidence, to well over 100 entries. The number is not fixed. It has never been fixed. The scholars who have worked through the old Babylonian tablets from Nippur, cross-referencing fragments held in Philadelphia and Chicago and Baghdad and Istanbul, have assembled what they can. But the complete list, if a complete list ever existed in a single canonical form, has not survived intact. What we have is long and varied and full of gaps. And the gaps are part of the texture of it now, the way the broken edge of the original tablet in the museum room was part of its texture. Absence as a kind of presence. The list begins, in the surviving lines, with the large offices. Kingship is among the first. The Lugal, the great man, the king, appears early. Alongside him, the En, the high priestly office that held authority of a different kind, not military or administrative, but sacred and representational. The throne is in the list, the noble scepter, the crown. These are the visible symbols of order, the things a civilization uses to mark who holds what, to make authority legible to those who fall under it. The Sumerians understood that a king without a throne was still a man, but a throne without a king was already a symbol waiting for occupation. The Me did not create kingship. They were, in the Sumerian understanding of the world, what kingship ran on. The list continues. The office of the god. Godship itself appears as an entry, which says something about how the Sumerians organized their understanding of the sacred. Not a statement about the nature of divinity, but about the institutional role, the function, the position within a cosmic structure. A place in the order of things, like any other place. The texts recorded alongside the offices of Earth as calmly as they record the rest. Over time, as the surviving lines move through the larger offices, the list opens into the crafts. Weaving. The tablets include it without comment. Leatherwork. The craft of the smith. The metalworker, whose art transformed ore into tools and weapons and ornaments. The shepherd's office, which in ancient Mesopotamia was not a humble occupation, but a term also applied to kings, and whose presence in the list reflects how deeply the management of livestock was woven into the economy of the plain. Agriculture. The planting and the harvest. These are not poetic entries, they are practical ones. The me were not only the grand structures, they also included the specific, hands-on knowledge that made daily life possible. The scribal arts appear as well. The art of writing, the practice of the aduba, the maintenance of records. All of this, in Sumerian understanding, was not a human invention, but a divine decree, one of the things that had been established as part of the fundamental order of civilized existence. The list settles, then shifts. Music. The texts include it. Rejoicing, lamentation. These two appear in proximity in the surviving lines, as they appeared earlier in the general description of what the me encompassed. The shadow alongside the light, the grief next to the celebration, both necessary, both part of what a civilization actually is, rather than what it aspires to be. Judgment appears, counsel, truth, falsehood. These last two together again, not as opposites that cancel each other out, but as coexisting entries in the same inventory, as if the Sumerians understood that a civilization capable of truth is always also capable of its opposite, and that the me named both because both were real. What's easy to forget reading a list this long is that the Sumerians were not producing a wish list. They were not describing an ideal civilization. They were describing civilization as it was, the full range of what human organized life involved. And so the list also includes items that a modern reader instinctively slows at. The descent into the underworld appears again in expanded form. The tablets mention weaponry, the destruction of cities, the lamentation that follows destruction. These entries are not glorified in the text. They are placed within the broader inventory with the same even cadence as everything else, as if the scribes who copied these lines understood that the me did not play favorites, that the catastrophic and the tender occupied the same cosmic list. Then the list returns to quieter ground. The kindling of fire, not the forge fire or the battle fire, but the domestic one. The fire in the household, the one that has been started and maintained by the same gestures for as long as fires have been kept. The extinguishing of fire. Both appear as separate entries, which is a detail worth sitting with. Not just the fire itself, but the act of ending it. The deliberate, careful putting out, the last tending of the coals before sleep. The art of the cook is in there. The preparation of food, the transformation of raw things into something nourishing. These entries pull the list back from the cosmic and the institutional into something that smells of wood smoke and tastes of bread. Meanwhile, the scholars have spent considerable effort on the entries that survive only partially. There are lines in the surviving tablets where a single sign is legible, enough to suggest a category, not enough to name it. There are lines where the cuneiform is physically intact, but the Sumerian term has not yet been convincingly translated, or where different scholars propose different meanings, and none has been accepted as definitive. The ETCSL marks these carefully. The translations available to a general reader carry small notations: a question mark, a bracketed alternative, a footnote that says the reading is uncertain. The list as a whole has a ragged bottom edge. It does not conclude, it trails. The translation problem reaches beyond individual damaged signs. The word me itself has been rendered differently by different scholars across the history of the field. Divine decrees is one of the older translations, reflecting the early scholarly instinct to find a parallel in familiar religious frameworks. Ordinances appears in some readings. Cosmic powers, cultural norms, archetypes, divine offices. None of these has won the field. Each captures something of what the surviving texts suggest, and each leaves something out. The Sumerian term may simply be doing a kind of conceptual work that does not have a close equivalent in any modern language, which is not unusual for ancient technical vocabulary, but is particularly pointed here, because the me are themselves a concept about the structure of meaning. The boat is still on the canal. The night is very quiet around it. The water barely moves. The entries in the surviving list that scholars have reconstructed with the most confidence tend to cluster in certain thematic areas: governance, sacred office, craft, emotional and social experience. The entries that remain uncertain or damaged tend to cluster elsewhere, in regions of the list that suggest categories the surviving copies did not preserve well, or that the old Babylonian copyists themselves found difficult. The shape of the known list is not random. It reflects the conditions of its own survival: which tablets were buried, which were fired, which were copied more often than others, which were held in institutions that persisted long enough for the tablets to reach the 19th century excavators intact. What people rarely think about is that the me we know are partly a function of ancient archival luck. The entries we can read are the ones that survived. The entries we cannot read were also there once. The total inventory, if such a thing existed, was almost certainly longer than what the tablets now give us. The Sumerians may have had a number in mind. Scholars have speculated about this without reaching agreement. Some compositions use round numbers in contexts that suggest a symbolic completeness. Others seem to expand or contract the list depending on the literary context in which it appears. Whether there was ever a single authoritative canonical count of the me, a number beyond which nothing else was included, the surviving record does not confirm. The canal narrows slightly as it approaches the northern end of the marshlands, where the channels feeding into Uruk's dock system begin to branch. The current is barely perceptible. The night is still. The palm trees thin out, and the flat plain opens on both sides of the channel, and in the distance, faint against the dark, the stepped profile of the Iana begins to take shape above the roofline. The boat of heaven continues its slow approach. The inventory it carries, named and unnamed, complete and broken, rides with it on the water, in whatever form a list of divine ordinances could be said to occupy space on a reed boat moving by moonlight toward the city of Inanna. Back down the canal, in the direction of Eridu, something has shifted. The texts record what happens next only in outline, and the lines are among the more damaged sections of the surviving composition. But the shape of it is clear enough. Enki, the tablets suggest, has begun to notice what was given away. Isimud, his two-faced minister, is the figure the narrative turns to at this point, and the quiet pursuit that follows is not yet underway, but the conditions for it are already forming in the dark water behind the boat. The shift back at Eridu was not sudden. The tablets don't describe a moment of alarm or sharp realization. What the surviving lines suggest is something quieter than that. Unnoticing. The way you notice a sound has stopped, rather than the moment a sound begins. Something that had been present for a very long time was no longer where it had been. The Abzu was the same. The mud brick walls were the same. The water in the pool still reflected the lamps in the same slow way. But the me, as the composition frames it, were already on the canal. Enki sent Isimud. The minister with the doubled face moves through the surviving text as a messenger rather than a pursuer. Or at least, that is how the lines that are legible present him. He travels along the canal in the direction of Uruk, which means he travels in the same direction as the boat of heaven, but behind it. The text records his mission in the terms available to it. Retrieve what was given. Speak to Inanna. Convey the message. The exchange that the surviving lines preserve is formal and measured. Isimud delivers what he was sent to say. Inanna's response, in the tablets that preserve this portion of the composition, is equally formal. She does not concede. The boat continues. Isimud returns. Enki sends him again. The pattern repeats. The surviving text records it across several cycles, each one following the same structure, each one ending the same way. This is the part of the composition that reads most clearly as literary architecture. The repetition is not accidental. It has the quality of a formal structure, the kind of repeated sequence that appears in ritual texts, in lament poetry, in compositions meant to be memorized and recited rather than read privately in silence. Each cycle of the pursuit lands and releases without resolution, the way a refrain lands and releases. The boat moves on. The message is delivered. The message is answered. The boat moves on. The surviving lines of the pursuit sequence are among the better preserved sections of the composition, relative to some of the other damaged portions. Scholars have been able to reconstruct the shape of the exchange with some confidence, though individual lines remain uncertain in places. What comes through clearly is the structure: pursuit, confrontation in the formal literary sense, response, continuation. Inanna does not turn back. The Mi do not return to Eridu. By the time the boat arrives at the quay of Uruk, and the surviving text does record an arrival, a reception, a celebration at the dock, the transfer is presented by the composition as complete. The tablets describe the quay at Uruk as a place of welcome. What was brought is received. The composition, in the lines that survive the arrival scene, has a quality of settlement. The inventory that began in Eridu has found its destination. What the Sumerians understood this to mean for the cultic standing of Uruk is embedded in the narrative itself. A city that held the Mi held something foundational. Not authority in the administrative sense, but legitimacy in a deeper, less arguable sense. The sense of being the city where the organizing principles of civilized existence now resided. For a while, this story was studied primarily as mythology. That is, scholars read it as a religious composition describing events in a divine register. A story about gods, not about cities or institutions or historical processes. That reading is still valid as far as it goes. But over time, as more of the surrounding material became available, and as the archaeology of the region became more detailed, a different layer became legible. Uruk's rise to regional dominance in the late 4th millennium is a documented historical fact. Eridu's gradual decline as a center of institutional life is also attested. The composition may be carrying both things at once, the theological statement and the historical memory, layered inside each other the way clay layers press together in a tell. The scholars who work on this don't claim to have resolved it. They note the parallel. They hold it open. What is harder to hold open is the question of authorship, and this is where the story makes contact with a person whose name has actually survived. Enheduanna. The name appears in colophons, the identifying notes scribes added to the ends of compositions, across a number of texts preserved from the Old Babylonian period. She is identified there as the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who ruled the First Mesopotamian Empire in the late 3rd millennium BCE, somewhere around 2334 to 2279 BCE by modern reckoning. She served as high priestess of the moon god Nana at the city of Ur. Her dates are placed by scholars at approximately 2285 to 2250 BCE, and the compositions attributed to her, chief among them the text known today as the Exaltation of Inanna, are among the oldest literary works attributed to a named individual anywhere in the surviving record. The claim of authorship in ancient sources does not automatically mean what it means today. Ancient attributions were sometimes honorific, sometimes conventional, sometimes accurate in a more complicated sense than modern authorship implies. A small number of recent scholars have raised questions about the reliability of the colophon attributions for Enheduanna's works, not dismissing them, but noting that the copies we have were made centuries after her lifetime, and that the transmission history raises legitimate questions. The majority of scholars who work on the period accept the attribution with appropriate caution, acknowledging what can be confirmed and what cannot. What can be confirmed is that the texts attributed to her are extraordinary documents, and the most significant of them, for this story, is the Nin Me Shara. The opening words of the composition translate approximately as Lady of all the Me. It is an address to Inanna, extended, formal, deeply literary, and concerned throughout with exactly the concept that has been following this documentary from its beginning. The Me appear in the hymn not as a list to be enumerated, but as an attribute of Inanna herself. She is described as holding them, wearing them, radiating them. The composition is not a theological argument, and it is not a myth in the narrative sense. It is something closer to a sustained act of formal address, a literary devotional that accumulates its meaning through repetition and variation rather than through plot. Scholars who have studied the Nin Me Shara closely tend to describe it as one of the most technically sophisticated Sumerian compositions that has survived. The language is dense, the imagery is layered. The references to the Me are embedded within a larger meditation on Inanna's nature that touches governance, war, love, the movement of celestial bodies, the ordering of the land. It is a document that assumes its audience already knows what the Me are, that assumes familiarity with the concept as a foundational term rather than as something requiring explanation. That assumption of shared understanding is itself informative. The Me, by the time of Enheduanna's compositions, were not new. They were not a theory being introduced. They were part of the inherited vocabulary of Sumerian sacred thought, something a high priestess writing formal hymns in the late 3rd millennium could invoke without gloss, the way a writer today might invoke the idea of law or justice without defining the term from scratch. The scribal tradition that preserved these texts extended forward and sideways from Enheduanna's time in ways that continued to reference the Me. Temple hymns associated with the major sanctuaries of Sumer reference the Me in passing. The composition known as Enki and the World Order, a different text, also associated with Enki, preserved in Old Babylonian copies and studied extensively by scholars throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, describes Enki assigning me to various aspects of the physical world: rivers, fields, cities, the offices of specific deities. The Me in that text function as the mechanism by which Enki orders the world into its proper divisions. Each thing receives its function. Each function receives its name. The concept did not stop at the Sumerian language. As Mesopotamian culture developed through the Akkadian Empire and the later Babylonian and Assyrian periods, related concepts appeared in Akkadian. The Parsu, often translated as divine offices or rites, carries some of the same territory as the Sumerian Me. The Tablet of Destinies, the Tupi Shimati, which appears in Akkadian mythological texts as an object of divine significance whose possession confers cosmic authority, has been discussed by scholars in relation to the Me, though the two concepts are not identical, and the relationship between them is debated rather than settled. The question of how much continuity exists between the Sumerian Me and the later Akkadian concepts is one that the evidence does not fully resolve. Languages change. Concepts migrate. Something gets carried forward, and something gets left behind. And the seam between the two is not always visible in the surviving record. Meanwhile, back on the canal, and this is where the text and the night and the long, slow movement of the documentary begin to settle against each other. The pursuit has ended. The tablets record Inanna's arrival. The tablets record the reception. The boat of heaven has made its journey. The Me are at Uruk. The composition, in its surviving form, does not dwell on what this meant for Eridu. The old city at the edge of the marsh simply recedes behind the narrative. The texts move on. The water is still. And the list, the long, incomplete, partially broken, never fully translatable list of the things that hold civilization together, has now been delivered to the city where Inanna, in Sumerian tradition, held her seat. What it meant for the people who first wrote it down is a question the tablets hold without answering. What it meant for the scribes who copied it centuries later, working in a language that was no longer anyone's mother tongue, is another question the tablets hold with the same quiet patience. The Iana's stepped outline rises above the flat roofline of Uruk in the pre-dawn dark. The canal water is still. The The boat has arrived. And somewhere behind all of this, behind the composition, behind the lists, behind the pursuit and the inventory and the hospitality scene at the freshwater shrine, the word me sits exactly where it began, small and quiet and stubbornly resistant to a single clean translation, carrying more than it appears to contain.